It's good that we gather here this morning, here in our local community on a beautiful autumn morning. And I acknowledge the veterans of Australia, the men and women of the Australian Defence Force, you the members of our local community. And it is truly a wonderful thing to see all of our school children out in such great numbers this ANZAC Day 2013. 100 years ago, in 1913, the federal member for Brisbane, a man by the name of William Finlayson, told the Australian Parliament this. He said, and I quote him, "It is reasonable to say that as the years go on, the danger of war is not increasing. The wisdom, the intelligence, the reasonableness of the nations are coming to our aid, and there is less danger of war today than there was 10 years ago." He continued, "The tendency in the civilized countries of the world is stronger than ever it was before towards peace." Less than 1 year after he made those remarks, the young men of Queensland were enlisting in the 2nd and the 5th Australian Light Horse, together with the 9th and 15th Infantry Battalions, to fight in the war to end all wars. In fact, it was these brave men of Queensland who went on to participate in the great counter-offensive of August 1918, which became the turning point in the war against Germany, a day that German Field Marshal Erich Ludendorff described as the Black Day of the German army in this war. War is not just a thing of kings and emperors, of presidents, of prime ministers, of generals and of admirals. War, in all of its horror, is a very personal thing and a very local thing as well. Here in our local community, here in Bulimba, here on the south side of Brisbane, we sent 205 of our best local lads to Gallipoli. They came from each of our local suburbs, and many never came home. Many of those who did were scarred for life, and the great trees planted here, which stand behind me today, are planted in their honour. The sobering thing is that 100 years later, William Finlayson, the federal member for Brisbane, way back then, he was not alone in his views 100 years ago that war was impossible. In fact, there's an extraordinary book that's just been published entitled The Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914, which documents how many of the European leaders of that time considered the possibility of war as remote, arguing instead that in an age of unprecedented economic integration, it simply made no sense taking up arms against one another. Despite, or perhaps even because of this underlying mindset, Europe instead managed to lurch from crisis to crisis before war finally seemed no longer impossible, but in fact inevitable by the time they reached the summer of 1914. And the rest, they say, is history. And for Australia, a country then of barely 5 million people, nearly 400,000 of us put on the uniform of Australia, 152,000 of whom were wounded, and 62,000 lay dead on foreign soil, where they remain to this day. And among them, so many of our very own local Bulimba lads as well. It's difficult to picture these numbers in our mind's eye, but next time any of you are at Lang Park, think of that stadium full to the brim, and then imagine each of those attending as wearing the khaki uniform of Australia, sitting as silent sentinels of the war to end all wars. So what would these Anzacs say to us gathered here in this beautiful memorial park? What would they say to us nearly 100 years later? It's of course presumptuous for any of us to speak on behalf of the dead. But from their dispatches and their diaries and their letters home, we can pick up certain gleanings. I think the first is this. They would remind us, first and foremost, of the need for eternal vigilance. Like William Finlayson 100 years ago, I wish we could all simply wave away the prospect of war in the future. But to do so would be the height of national irresponsibility. In fact, the first responsibility of the Commonwealth, given where we found ourselves both in 1914 and later in 1939, is to have made full preparations for our proper national defence. And this means proper planning and proper resourcing for the future needs of the men and women who proudly wear the uniform of Australia today. The lesson of history is that we do not know the day nor the hour. I believe the second message from the heroes of ANZAC would be for us then to do everything within our diplomacy to avoid the calamity of war. There is nothing determinist about history. We choose our future, and the nations of the world choose their futures as well. And it is their leaders who choose where our futures are governed, whether they are governed by cooperation or conflict, whether they are governed by war or peace. The truth is, Australia today has its national being in a highly uncertain part of the world. Our region remains riven with crises and rumours of wars, great and small. Therefore, our nation has the highest responsibility to continue to do everything within the powers of its diplomacy to sow the seeds of peace, to help define other pathways through the inevitable international disagreements which from time to time arise, and to encourage our friends, our partners and our allies to walk in those pathways with us. Because the searing letters from our warriors past, the searing letters that they wrote home, describing painfully and bloodily the horrors of the battlefield, demand that we do so. The formal missives from their field commanders informing families that they had lost not just one son, but two sons, and in the case of some families, 3 sons in a single battle. They demand that we do the same as well. And then there are the photographs. How many among you have looked carefully at the photographs of the faces of the young men who went to war in the war to end all wars? We're all familiar with the photographs of Aussies playing the larrikin, swimming on the beaches at Gallipoli, climbing the Great Pyramids of Egypt, enjoying a general knees-up with the local French fillies when on leave on the Western Front. This is all true and it's all part of the Australian nature, but there are other photographs as well, such as those captured in Ross Coulthard's recent labour of love, The Lost Diggers, and the haunted face of one George Gordon Gilbert, 18-year-old at best before he gave his life, his photo taken before he was blown to bits at the Battle of Amiens. No human being could look at his photo without being moved, even 100 years on, and moved to action to help stop other young boys such as him being carved to pieces in the future. War is the ultimate human horror. Let us hope that it is not for every generation to discover afresh before the memories of previous horrors are fully erased. Instead, let us harness our energies and our talents to turn our swords into ploughshares. If there is one final message from those whose ghostly souls are among us today in these trees, perhaps it is simply this: that we Australians are at our absolute best when we are serving the needs of others rather than just grafting for ourselves. Amidst, oftentimes, our national political rancor, we often lose sight of this most simple but eloquent of truths. Many of our divisions, in fact, seem to be manufactured as some form of bizarre public entertainment as we strut and fret our hour upon the stage and are heard no more. Whereas the overwhelming yearning of our people is for us to come together on the essential things for our nation's future. to work together on the things that matter, just as we would encourage the nations of the world to work together for our common human purpose. Otherwise, the disease of division will ultimately rend us all apart. As others have said before me, in things essential, unity. In things non-essential, diversity. In all things, service to our families and service to our communities. Otherwise, we fail to keep the flame of hope alive for our nation's future. And then much of their sacrifice, the sacrifice of our veterans, would have been in vain. So whatever our callings in life may be, wherever our life or work may take us, ANZAC Day also calls on all of us to be their worthy successors in building this Australian nation together. So on this eve of the centenary of the war to end all wars, let us all ponder these things afresh. Vigilance for our national defence, fully engaged in the diplomacy of peace in a region which threatens so much war, and together building the future of this great nation of ours, Australia. These, I believe, are the messages of ANZAC for us today.